Hey, good evening, solutionaries, solutionary audience, my favorite people that come together and help me brainstorm, that welcome amazing guests onto our show and take it to the next step of understanding where are we in the solutions becoming widely available for you, for me, for our children, our grandchildren, and for the global expansion of humanity in our future. And tonight we have very much in alignment with that understanding a younger, I would say millennial. That's a compliment to him because as a big thinker and as one that I have circled back with many times from past guests and have had him presented to me multiple times on the realms of big thinking, consciousness, where are we and where are we taking this future as an awakened society. Again and again, the name has been dropped. You need to have Simon Esler on the show. So for our solutionaries that are joining us tonight from many of the communities that we all share, because we're one big community with lots of little circular microcosmic communities that are coming together and realizing we have a lot more in common than we have that divide us. And hopefully we'll get to the point where we are co-creating much more cohesively with one another. Help me welcome Simon Esler. Simon, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it had to happen, and I appreciate your patience in having to reschedule a time or two just to make it work because life is happening. Big events are taking place in all of our lives, as well as so much on the political center stage, and so much of what we've been anticipating is going to be some data drops and intel this and QN on that, and a lot of potential arrests and a lot of need for us to come together, as you and I have been chatting about prior to coming on the air. We have so many in our community that are just sitting on the edge of their seats saying, what's the next data drop? What is the next juicy tidbit? What did QAnon say recently? What is Corey Good, picking up from those off-world beings that are giving him information? And I think that you and I both agree, as do many in our community, while that is all very important, we need to be doing the inner work and actually being very instrumental in setting the stage, being prepared for things as they are relayed, and being okay with ourselves, being really well integrated with ourselves. And you mentioned before we went on the air that was part of a recent video submission that you did today. Why don't we lead with that? Why don't you tell our audience kind of where you were in feeling led to want to bring that forth today on the heels of the 11/11 meditation and so much of this cohesiveness that our community is binding up and being a part of together?
Yeah, absolutely. So the video I put out today was in support of the process of forgiveness, especially in the context of some of the crimes that are going to be revealed. So a particular focus in the video today was really on how are we going to manage the unveiling of all this pedophilia? How are we going to deal with sealed indictments that reveal the human trafficking problem on this planet as it really is? And what can we do to begin this process of forgiveness, knowing that there was going to be this volatile response from a lot of the public, right? It's well expected that there will be a lot of anger and a lot of desire for revenge, a lot of feelings of hatred. This is going to be a natural part of it. And I think that our community and all the little subsets of communities within it, we have this incredible potential to begin that process of forgiveness, of holding the space for the healing now,
Mhm.
before the unsealing of these indictments, before there is more of a public revelation of what the cabal and the deep state have been up to. We can start doing that work now because we've been doing the research. We've been immersing ourselves in this material. We've been going through the steps psychologically of comprehending and accepting what has gone on. So I just
Mm.
think this community is uniquely positioned to start that work. And so the video today is a call to action for our community to start that process.
And I apologize that I haven't seen it. As I said, I am just on the heels of coming back from the conference in DC, which technically wasn't a conference. It was actually a gathering. It was a very organic gathering that was very well put together. And it was open to the public. It was beautiful right there at the end of the mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. We had this mass meditation with, the reflective pond behind us and the National Monument and Capitol Hill behind us, and looking up at, those that were leading this group in a meditation that was really in depth and really rich. And coming home, I took some public transit there and back, getting from, North Carolina to DC. There was a lot of time to integrate and a lot of time to feel into what are the missing pieces that I have maybe not fully processed to be someone that aspires to be a way shower, an advocate of our society and certainly of our community to be doing the work, because we do need to be several steps ahead of the average citizen of this world, certainly of this country, as some of these data drops happen. So we do have to talk about integration, don't we, Simon? What have we
Yes.
done to heal and love and forgive ourselves first, which is always, it's not trite. It's massive that we really
Yes.
need to be okay with ourselves and our own shadow, our own multidimensionality, which very much is going to experience both ends of that spectrum of light and dark, benevolence and malevolence, so that we can not just be talking at the forgiveness when a lot of these data drops and these arrests and a lot of this revelation happens, but really come from a place that is heart-based and genuine, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I think, we really have to consider the power that we have as a community. We know that those who have sort of manipulated this planet and those that have been in darker places of power, this is a very small group of people, right? We're
Mhm.
talking less than 1% who have been using the collective consciousness to their advantage. So if we look at it that way, then we can flip it around and see that our little community has so much power to steer things in a positive direction, to help bring us towards the most positive timeline. And people do forget, because we're caught up in so much information gathering and waiting for these intel drops, people do forget how important it is that their inner work be done, that the
Mhm.
spreading of the information, if that's all that we're doing, the impact is lessened if we're not spreading it while we're in a heart-centered space. If we're not spreading it with these loving intentions, there's a lot of balance to be done there. And I really, uh, when you mentioned some of the downtime in between intel drops and when people are waiting for an update from someone like Corey Good, and there are these periods when things go quiet, and I notice how impatient people tend to get. But I
Yes.
think that these quiet periods are a calling to do more inner work. For those who are following Q really closely, and there's 20 days of darkness from that operation, this is a perfect time to be realigning inwardly, to be making sure that you're doing that work, so that when the next big release, when the next big drop occurs, you're in a different place. So these ebb and flow patterns of informational disclosure coming out and then silence, to me, that naturally frames work that we can be doing to find that heart-centered space to push things forward more.
I absolutely agree with you on that, Simon. And I even want to encourage the fact that maybe this is also an opportunity, because when you're eager for not just more intel to feed a void place within yourself, but maybe you're even looking for corroboration because you're having your own prophetic dreams, you're having your own meditative visionary hits, and you're looking for corroboration. This is an opportunity to expand what you believe to be your community and actually see through some investigation, through some research, where else is my community that maybe I have not touched upon before. And for me, I'll just give you a great example. On the way up to DC on the train, YouTube has some shadow banning and it has some tricky analytics sometimes. It doesn't always immediately reveal next video up from the last one that you've watched from some of your favorites that have been part of your long-standing community. It doesn't always show you who else might be part of your community. It's either contrived or it's the way that their analytics is done, or it's both. But it's an opportunity then to say, I'm feeling this propensity of motion that is, to me, needing to be corroborated outside of my own immediate purview. Where else can I get more of information? And so on the train, I actually came across Edge of Wonder. Great work that Rob and Ben are doing. And
Oh
they're
yeah.
so fun and they're so upbeat, and they keep everything really light, but really get to the heart and the core and the soul of some of these topics. And I thought, what are the chances that I have not run across their work before? But I do understand shadow banning. I do understand that I've had some of my videos repressed on YouTube. I've had, subs come and tell me that. And I was so tickled. I walked straight up to them at the conference and we were able to corroborate some things. So I want to encourage our community to go inward, maybe deepen your meditative practice, maybe go into more, healing work and reflection and journaling and doing some deep dives into integration for yourself. But it also may be an opportunity, instead of going to your favorite YouTube submission or production studio intel drops and getting your favorite crack, you're tapping the vein, see where else there may be an audience that is seeking you out, that actually gives you a perspective that we are so much bigger than most of us have been led to believe that we are. We're not fringe. We have an entire community within a mainstream model of awakening, and it helps us recognize we have a lot more in common than we might have otherwise felt, having up until this point been more of the fringe or the quote unquote black sheep, as I've heard it stated about us many
Yes.
times before.
Yes, absolutely. There has been a really big shift for us in terms of more mainstream access and just becoming more aware and cohesive as a community. I've really felt and watched that occurring. And I think that's part of this community stepping into its power and stepping into its potential and releasing all the insecurities that come from being targeted as a community for so long, right? Being
Absolutely.
the targets of division tactics and psychological operations and disinformation that have made it very difficult for this truth seeking community to find coherence. And now I think we're stepping into our own power to a certain extent, that we've become immune to a lot of those attacks, and our cohesiveness is remaining now despite some of those current attacks. And it's really amazing to see. It's very powerful to observe it in action.
Mhm. I think that not only that, I think that as we start paying attention to some of the divisiveness that also comes with that, because with growth comes questioning what we knew before. And so that's going to happen within our groups as well. We have some that say, I'm not entirely certain I buy completely into this person's version of an up and coming reality, or I'm not as stoutly standing behind certain political narratives and some action that is taking place being entirely benevolent, as opposed to having someone who's using their own agenda to gain the popularity of the masses. And again, we just become dogmatically following the next leading voice. This is kind of leading into the question that you and I were going to discuss to really start off today, about QAnon and full disclosure and what role it plays in that. I think that what I'm hearing you say, and what I'm completely in agreement with you on, is while we're looking at this large community for which we are part, we can never let go of the discernment that each of us need to develop as an intuitive faculty, that we take everything back to some anchored and foundational place that is truth within ourselves. And we don't have to bash anyone else whose discernment doesn't look like ours. Just recognize we have to be our own witness. And that's part of our emotional and our spiritual maturation.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I really have found, in working with the QAnon operation, with the disclosures embedded within QAnon, and in supporting the development of the QAnon community. So, in the QAnon think tank, which is the group that I spearheaded, which is now it's being maintained by this incredible team of people that came forward to support the project. It's been really amazing to see the evolution of that community and where it has taken discernment specifically,
Mm.
because this particular operation, it functions on the necessity that people do their own research. It's not that people are given these truths. The
Right.
point of the way this information is laid out is you go through it yourself. The information is there. You have more than you know. And so that particular operation is very empowering in the way that it says your awakening is your responsibility, and we are not taking charge of your awakening. We are supporting the conditions for you to take charge of your awakening. And so I
Yeah.
see the QAnon disclosures as helping refine the discernment skills of a lot of people who were actually not part of this community before. So people who are new to the
Mhm.
idea of the deep state and to some of this more conspiratorial material. But even those who are sort of old school in the community have been brought to a greater sense of discernment in following the QAnon disclosures. So when I look at the way the QAnon operation fits into full disclosure, I see it as um, this little sphere in which people are being refined and being brought to a sense of their own awakening as their own responsibility, so that when they have to come into the material and the disclosures that go beyond Q and that exist on the outside of this operations scope, that they then have the faculties, the skills, the capacity to move into that information that is going to be so challenging. And one of the things that Q has said in a number of different ways during this operation is that when the truth finally comes out, when everything is released, the choice to know will be yours. And it will be a choice because it will be difficult for many to face what comes out. And I think that's important to remember in bridging the QAnon disclosures with the full disclosure movement.
So that's an important statement. And I want to build off of that because, for many, there is a righteous indignation pull. And I've been guilty of this. I'm going to tell you this right now. I was raised very dogmatic, and I was raised with an attitude of there is one right way. And as we each evolve, and as I certainly took my evolution and studying philosophy and making that a very big academic goal and understanding world religion, mystery schools, etc., I recognized divinity is very generous in its iterations of itself and its interpretations of itself. So everyone is not only not going to hear all the same information, even though the information is out there, it may not be chosen to be received, but it also isn't going to be perceived exactly the same way. So that kind of leads into the next question. There has to be compassion at every step because there's going to be cognitive dissonance no matter what. There is going to be those that are in resistance to growth at the level that some of us are ready for society to grow, so they don't co-create with us. But it takes it into the next piece, Simon, which is how do we use consciousness and discernment, highly discerned, well-honed discernment to expand our consciousness into righteous activism, into meaningful activism? How do you see those two connected?
That's a really interesting question. So I really find that my development of discernment in relation to consciousness has been rooted in trusting my own experiences, going first from what I have experienced directly,
Mm-hmm.
and not getting caught up in the challenge of um, trying to believe other people's stories or other people's experiences that exist outside of what has come into my life. So, discernment for me begins with having a very clear connection with our own personal experience. And then from there, what we can do is seek resonance. So, you may be exploring the testimony of someone uh, who has very incredible stories, and they may be far beyond your own experience. So I
Mhm.
find that instead of trying to apply belief to that scenario, that instead what we do is check in with our own experiences, with what has really occurred for us in our journey that resonates, and then use resonance to explore what others are putting out instead of
Mhm.
belief. And I think that belief is very challenging when it comes to this kind of material, because we are naturally beings who work with opposites, right? We have duality within us. So anytime we're trying to apply belief to material that we are exploring, some part of us is also struggling with disbelief. That those two are playing out within us all the time. And so it can create great contradictions. Whereas if we are seeking with a sense of our own experience as our basis, and from that looking for resonance, then I find the process of discernment is much more powerful and much more effective. And then there's less anxiety and contradiction in the process of moving through material that is very expansive, very challenging, and is surrounded by a lot of disinformation, and is surrounded by a lot of targeted mainstream media that pressures us into feeling like what we're doing is crazy or inappropriate. Does that
Right.
make sense?
It does. It does. And that was, you actually answered that in a very rolling way that opened up a lot of extra doors that can be explored. But I want to bring it back to the discernment piece again, because in the first chapter of my book, The Reluctant Intuitive, I recognize the biggest reason why I was reluctant, and I see this in other members of our community, Simon. I mean, you flow, you're much more forthcoming, but having had great conversations, with others in our community, even recently with Corey at the 1111 and talking to Adam Riva from Dauntless Dialogue, some of the topics that we bring forward because we've studied them, we've researched them. They've become witnesses in our experience. They've become things that we now know are embodied in our consciousness. And even the really, really fantastic things with extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings, heavenly and light beings, or dark realm beings, all of which I had experienced and caused me to be very reluctant to write the book. The first thing that I said to the naysayers is, hey, if this doesn't resonate with you, if your only goal is to come here and question my testimony, exit now. Stop reading now. You don't resonate with me and you don't serve me. You don't serve anyone else in this community and you don't serve yourself by being here. Once you have experience and you've been able to use a very lucid witness to experience and been able to disseminate it within your being and have it find a resonance of authenticity and truth in you, it doesn't matter how many stories people tell you, you're never going to have the same conviction with belief as you are when you are a personal witness of experience. And so, as you said, resonance is so important. If you want to buy into someone's story and you don't have the personal witness, we are all part of the absolute. We are all intrinsically connected, whether you're talking Albert Einstein and particle entanglement, spooky action at a distance, looking at recent quantum models, or looking off of, religious lore and some of the philosophy behind it of us all being one conscious, one divinity. If you really deeply, desperately want to know the truth of someone else's story, you can grit into that. You can have that conviction made manifest to you till it becomes a personal witness. And then it is something that you resonate with. But anything short of really trying to have a maturation of our personal experience and being able to find oneness with others around us rather than the right or wrong club is holding us back as a community, and it does a lot of detriment to some of those that I think that are new to the stage and are looking to find truth in some of the corners and some of the open spaces that we've created for them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's really beautiful way, to put it. I think that this foundation of personal experience is very powerful. And one of the ways we can watch out for this, let's say we're dealing with challenging information, with difficult testimony or research, one of the ways that we are often supported through personal experience is synchronicity. So you can be working with material that maybe you have less of a personal connection to, but you still feel drawn to it. And then what will often happen is then we are surrounded by synchronicities in our lives that encourage us to keep going down that path of research, to keep looking. So sometimes when we drop belief, what it makes room for are these moments of synchronicity that create a feeling in our body of support, of progression, of continuing down that path. And so when I say experience, I don't necessarily mean having, let's say, an extraterrestrial experience. Maybe you read material on that and you've never had that experience, but suddenly your life is flooded with synchronicities that are pushing you in that direction. And that's another
Mhm.
great way to look out for this and to find discernment within personal experience.
I agree. And wanting to be inclusive to those that we might have considered less educated about how the world has worked up until this point, what some of the struggles have been in the power plays between light and dark. It was one of the things we wanted to touch on is, you know, how willing are those that are part of making a big enough difference, that hundredth monkey, that the majority enough of the populace wanting change and being willing to get past that least denominator of comfort of, at least I'm getting my paycheck, at least I still am in a marriage that is barely satiating. How do you recommend for those that are in our community that are just ready to break down the dam, knock down the walls, rattle the people, get the sabers going and say, come on, we've got suppressed technology. We have got amazing free energy. We have spacefaring vehicles and devices. We have healing devices for our bodies. We have regenerative systems that we can have. And I want I'm speaking for myself very much on wanting to be one of those rattling saber advocates of, come on, everybody, let's get on board and help those that are not at the point of the learning curve that you and I would aspire and assume to be, while still respecting their sovereignty and their desire to move at a much slower pace. Let's go into that a little bit. How do we work through these dicey relationships and still be respectful of where everyone is in this journey, Simon?
I mean, really, one of the first things you want to do is know your audience, right? It really comes down to being present with who you're communicating with, because that's how you honor the process of each being. So if you're genuinely aware of where someone is at and you're meeting them where they're at, you're going to be of service to their path of awakening, whether that seems uh, far away from your point of comprehending a bigger picture or certain information. So I have found it very helpful to uh, become a better listener, right? So I know that there's this feeling of, oh my gosh, I have so much information to give, people need to know so much, but sometimes it's more effective to give a small amount of information and to deeply listen to the way that person responds and to feel into their response, because that's going to give you impetus to bring whatever is most helpful for that person or that group in that circumstance. So one
Right.
of the
And that's
ways,
often referred to as
go
the
ahead.
10% rule, isn't it, Simon? I've heard David Wilcock refer to, just give them the
Yeah.
10%. And then if they're ready for
Yes.
more, go into the next 10%. But when and forgive me for interrupting, but when we know that there's going to be potential data drops and heavy intel and a lot of revelations, and we've just had a major sting operation on human trafficking and pedophilia in Florida. We know that the Jesuits are looking at releasing in areas of the country some of the records that have been repressed. Um, are we able to still piecemeal that 10%? What is your feeling on that?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised at how much people will rationalize away even the biggest drops, right? If someone is in a place where it's too much for them, then their brain will make sure that the
Mhm.
information is compartmentalized in a way that they can handle it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean it's
cognitive
a
dissonance.
natural response. Yeah, and sometimes it's a survival mechanism. Sometimes it is legitimate. So I think that's why pairing that 10% rule with deep listening, with very careful sense of who you're communicating with is so important, because you're giving that 10%, but if you're just doing that and you still have this fervor within you to push people further along in their process, then it's going to interrupt your capacity to listen to their response and to really
Mhm.
feel where they're at. they may give you a response that makes it clear that you stop there and you leave it alone, and they may give you a response that says keep going. So,
Yeah.
one of the concepts, and I talked about this at Dimensions of Disclosure, one of the concepts that has been very freeing for me is that other people's awakening is actually none of your business. It's not up to you how someone else's journey unfolds. All we're trying to do is create the conditions for awakening so that people can take responsibility for that process, so that people can step into the conditions that we as a community have created. So if you look at something powerful like synchronicity and you see that someone is suddenly surrounded by synchronicity and it's supporting their awakening process, and that's a kind of divine intervention that's occurring, that's something very powerful that is far beyond our control. And so when we start to believe that someone else's awakening is our responsibility, we're totally disregarding their guides, their higher self, and the
Mhm.
synchronicities that are poised to surround that person. So when you understand that people, each as individuals, are deeply supported in their awakening beyond anything we can do, then all you're doing is very gently trying to create supportive conditions. And you're not trying to control when and how anyone else wakes up. So this feeling, this sense of other people's awakening is not your responsibility, it's technically none of your business. For me, that's very freeing, because then I can really get into the work of cultivating an environment that supports that person who's finally ready. That when they step into it, there's an informative, kind, and open space for them to be supported in taking responsibility for their awakening.
It's a beautiful way that you relay that, Simon, and every part of that waves over me like, yes, of course. Divinity is so diverse. It has allowed multiverse within multiverse, fractalized aspects of itself into such expansive realms that we can't even begin to comprehend it in this third and fourth dimensional density meat suit. It just makes your brain pop. Of course, it has its own timelines for every single one of us, and it has to be allowed. This is a free will universe. This is where everything is allowed. I think where some of us, especially those of us that are big advocates that are willing to put the day job on hold or morph that day job, as I have done, and make it about how do I support those that don't know that what they're hearing in mainstream media, what they're hearing in these locked appearing segregated systems of humanity in government, in education, in food, in whatever we happen to be talking about. How do I help them to recognize that there's a lot more solutions out there? There is a lot more progression that is available if you know where to look, and put those solutionaries in front of them so that we don't trip into hopelessness. Because, of course, I see that. I've experienced it myself. And many that are part of this community, many that are listening right now, know that I just lost a daughter to hopelessness. And that's really what it was. I don't blame mental health on its own, that it did not give her what she needed in terms of proper funding for medications, even though that happens to be true, that the system did not, that it denied her Medicaid, even when she financially should have been receiving it at that time in her life, which is true, that even the mental health realm didn't pay any attention to the 95% of dark energy, dark matter that has so much of an interplay and an influence on every single one of us, which is also true. There was just a feeling that the world is unfair and that there was not going to be a solution fast enough. And I know that we are losing a lot of young people, not just young people, but there's many that don't know where to look. So as an advocate and as a young person, Simon, what do you say as a very acute listener and one that has a lot of information when they say, you know what, it's just, I'm just one drink away, or I'm one, substance away from not caring anymore. I got to dial it down. I got to numb it down. This world makes no sense to me. Where do you take that 10% rule and that beautiful, acute, and really honest listening that is part of who you are and what you've developed, and bring those hopeless back into a place of seeing that there is a promise of something better? I know that's a loaded question, forgive me, but that's really where many of us are right now.
Absolutely. For me, it's very simple. That when someone is in that place, that it should be treated as very sacred, and that there is something very, very important and very delicate happening within that heart during that kind of experience. And so, for me, the first step there is a practice of non-interference. Of there's a shaman that I've worked with who's really great named Lujan Mattis, and one of the things he says is um, life can be a process of observing what you're interfering with rather than interfering with what you're observing. And
Mm,
I find that to be very medicinal when I'm facing someone who is in those kind of depths that um, I might have desires to fix or to take them away from those negative feelings, or to somehow interfere in a way that makes me feel like I'm bringing them out of it. But maybe in that moment, it's more about deep presence with that person's state of being. And this is where I think we are all capable of being intuitive empaths. That when you can quiet your own agenda to correct someone else's experience, and when you can really feel into where they are at and hold that space within your being, they
hmm.
can feel that as well. That
Yes.
people sense when you're just quietly holding the space for them, that can sometimes be more impactful than any little tidbit of advice or spiritual wisdom or information you can give that person. That sometimes it's quiet, subtle support that
Hmm.
can bring someone out of that. And I had an experience like that at Dimensions of Disclosure. I was going through a lot, the week before I arrived at the conference, my mother passed away. And I was in a very challenging space. There was a lot of things going on. And while I was at the conference, one of my mom's best friends passed away. And so it was this just a huge wave of something else occurring, of adding on to what I was already processing. And there was this very beautiful, gentle moment when the friends that I was with at that moment, when I found out, none of them really said anything. They each just gently placed their hand on me and just waited. And that was so much more than any kind of spiritual advice that they could have given me in that moment. It was so much more than any assessment or analysis of what I was feeling. It was so simple and subtle. And I think sometimes that subtlety, that practice of non interference, it needs to be given more importance in this kind of work, in helping someone who's perhaps in a place of hopelessness.
Wow. Wow. I'm feeling the magnitude of that, Simon. And I'm sorry about the losses that you've taken right now. I feel very deeply for what it took for you to show up and be there for our community and know that you needed to be present and that you needed to be available to them, and you had to go through your own processing at the same time. And that must have been deeply challenging. So I want to honor you first and acknowledge that you
Thank you.
still did show up, because it's easy to hide, isn't it? I mean, Simon, that the vulnerability that we have is those that get in front of others. The number one public fear is to get in front of others and to show up and not feel on point, or to feel that you are not able to devote all of your focus, all of your attention, all of your heart towards the message that you brought, because you have to, by necessity, be present for what you're processing at the same time. Is such a delicate dance. So I want to honor that. And I want to take it to the next level. What I'm hearing you say about showing up for those that are hopeless, which could be us at any given moment, but certainly there's many in our community that don't know of some of the things that keep you and I maybe north of hopeful, is is what I heard was how you were handled by those that cared for you at Dimensions of Disclosure, which was, instead of bombarding you with affection and advice and maybe even a lot of externalized prayer, they met you in a respectful place of resonance. It's a respectful resonance. It's, I will go where you are to the level that I can, and I will hold that space so you are not experiencing the extreme aloneness, and hold in a solidarity, hold in a bandwidth of compassion, some safe space for you to have companionship if you wish. And so I want to play with that a little bit and feel into that. What does it take to be someone that can hold respectful resonance, not just with some of the losses that many of us are experiencing with right now. Some are experiencing some challenges of having um, their whole reputation being challenged within our community. Others are feeling that there are dark attacks that have taken place on their ability to provide for themselves financially, health issues, and certainly family members and close friends and those that matter to us that we are losing. Really, the greatest kindness is to hold that resonance for one another. Wouldn't you say, Simon, based on what we're sharing now?
Yes, it's huge. It's huge. Yeah, I mean that moment will stand out for me, for the rest of my life. It was very beautiful and very subtle, and um, it was in stark contrast to uh, the sort of information heavy nature of the way this community often interacts.
Mhm.
And that was very, very beautiful to see. And it was a sense of family for me. It was really a moment of, my gosh, these people are their star family, their soul family. It was very clear in that moment that I was getting a kind of family support that
Yeah.
helped me immensely.
Well, so that kind of leads into another place that you and I wanted to explore. When we're dealing with this full disclosure movement, and this conversation is about that, and so many things, but we are about disclosure because those of us that seek it recognize we have the will, the divine will, and the right to call in disclosure for ourselves. Everyone else doesn't have to participate, but I think you and I are on the same page, as are many in our community. I am ready to have the truth of the nature of this world revealed. I would like to be able to participate in some very hard earned regenerative models of living. And while we're doing that, we also have to be part of finding resonance with our families, all of which may or may not be on board with where we are, and our friends, our immediate community. So, in terms of the full disclosure movement and where we wanted to go with how do we continue to navigate respecting everyone's spaces while creating new community and new family. Um, how do you see that we can be holding this view of what disclosure is so that we can be respectful of those? I heard Bridget Nielsen talk about this. You can go so far with family and then you got to back off a little bit. Laura Eisenhower talked about this just recently in DC yesterday about the fact that sometimes it just all comes out of her and that she has to realize she's got to taper it back a little bit. This seems to be a theme. One of the things you wanted to talk about is how do our families and how do our communities kind of play into how we still have the divine right to call in full disclosure for ourselves. What are your thoughts on that, Simon?
I think we want to, for ourselves, define family, right? There's a lot of different ways we can look at family when we're managing this process of disclosure. That we, of course, have the initial understanding, which is just our nuclear family on this planet. Our mother and father and siblings, and there's that definition of family, and then there's also the experience of soul family, and there's the experience of connecting with people on a level that, as I explained, really gave me a sense of family despite the fact that they weren't part of my sort of regular family back home. So I think if we can really clarify what we're speaking to when we say family, then we can start to explore the different things that are interacting with the disclosure process. So let's say we're talking about our immediate family, our parents, our siblings, those people that surround us immediately in this incarnation. Um, I know that often people are struggling with how to bring this information to their families and how to relate with their families. And I think what we want to focus on first when it comes to that challenge is the relationships, right? If you have uh, unresolved karma with family members that has made it difficult over the years to just connect, on a very
Right.
personal, authentic level, then you want to prioritize healing that before you seek to deliver charged disclosure based information to that family member. If you
Oh,
don't
yes.
have a strong relationship, then work on the relationship first, leave the intel for later.
Mhm.
Sometimes, perhaps, this kind of information can become a catalyst for healing a relationship with someone in the family. But I would say you don't necessarily need to lead with that. So that does come back to what we spoke about earlier, which is deep presence and listening with the person that we are with, genuine mindfulness. And if we're applying that to our family relationships, and if we're working to heal our family relationships that might have some turmoil, then we're going to create the conditions for being able to speak to these important truths. So I think in terms of that perspective of family, that definition of family, we need to lead with that sense of making sure the relationships are strong. And
Mhm.
if we have, I know that sometimes there are relationships that people struggle with in their immediate families that don't seem to have reconciliation and that
Mhm.
don't create an opportunity to have a very in-depth, close connection, and that's okay as well. But then that brings us back to the notion that someone else's awakening is not your responsibility. So make sure that you're not putting pressure on yourself to wake your family up because they are all surrounded by their own guidance, their own synchronicities, their own resonance. And so it's not your responsibility. So for anyone who's listening and is carrying that weight on their shoulders, I hope that you can let it go and trust in the awakening process of your family and be a resource for them when they're ready. So I think that's important in terms of that immediate family. But then there is
Very
this other definition of family that has to do with these soul connections and what
important.
I was describing as having experienced, and that connection to me is defined by finding those who are able to offer you unconditional support, that
Mhm.
those people who can be there for you where you're at and not seek to interfere with your process, not seek to try and manage your feelings or your experiences, that are able to just hold the space for where you're at and genuinely not interfere. I really find the practice of non-interference very, very important. So I think we
Mhm.
all need to be seeking out this sense of family that helps us feel we have unconditional support. And so we need to open up that definition so that perhaps if you cannot find that unconditional support in those people that have incarnated as your relatives, then you can definitely find these little family groups within the community that can offer
Mhm.
you that support. And I see
Yeah.
that happening in little nodes in our community, that the needs that people have not been able to meet with their immediate family, they're starting to meet in our community. And so really set the intention to seek out a sense of family so that your definition of that can expand to meet your needs.
Beautiful, beautiful, unquestionably. And when we talk about in our community, there's some catchphrases, and one of them is service to self as opposed to service to others. And one of the topics of exploration for Joy Jackson and I, when we do a live stream on Facebook Live with One Universe, which is a collaborative effort that kind of spills over from our own individual work, is to help our community, this familial community that you speak of, understand that it is not one exclusive pole as opposed to another. If we are not being sufficiently in service to our own selves to allow ourselves to up the ante and to say, you know what, I'm not surrounded by family, organic family, and community that is interested in what I'm interested in. But I'm not going to deny myself. I love myself, and my own unique desires and contributions are relevant sufficient that I'm going to go to that conference. I am going to engage in that Facebook group. I am going to rally with others that follow this YouTube channel, go to this gathering, etc. Because in service to myself, I also, by free will and by definition, should be able to call in that sense of externalized community and family as well. And I think that maybe for some, they think that it should be almost cannibalistically in poles, service to self, service to others. No, there's a beautiful gradient that's right in between that. And if we can't find that gradient, I think it's harder to find compassion. What are your thoughts on that, Simon?
Yes, absolutely. Trying to box it into these polarities, think can be very, very dangerous. Um, that gets us into this place of, judging the darkness. And that can create a sort of reductionism, I think, that it reduces compassion, it reduces
Mhm.
understanding, and we need compassion and understanding to find forgiveness. So that gradient to me is so important, and it's something that's being managed uh, through the QAnon disclosures. That as
Mhm.
people are studying what Q is dropping and the way Q is drawing attention to different players within this unfolding drama, that
Right.
people want to label certain players as white hat or black hat. And they've
Yes.
had to sort of slowly back off from those clear definitions and say there are gray hats. There are people who have done horrible things but aren't, committed to being members of the Illuminati, who have just lost their way, and they have maybe now offered themselves to support the alliance. And I know that, something came out recently in one of Corey Good's updates where a lot of the people that he was in touch with and that he was getting intel drops from have now been arrested because some of the things they were doing were just in the eyes of the alliance, things that needed to stop, that were wrong. So
Mhm.
they were playing a big role. They were helping feed Corey intel that was getting to our community and was waking us up. But now a lot of them are sitting in trials, facing some of the crimes they've done. And how do we define someone like that within this polarity of negative and positive paths? They don't fit,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't really allow free will its place within the conversation.
Mhm. Well, so this kind of brings us full circle. This is beautiful. It brought us full circle back to as there is ongoing disclosure, as we see more coming out from these 55,000 plus sealed indictments that become unsealed, where there is going to be some public transparency and maybe even some press, and certainly there's going to be military tribunals and courts, and the public becomes aware. It's a key element that you and I discussed coming on to the air tonight, that there still is going to have to be developmental compassion and forgiveness that starts with ourselves. We have to do our own shadow work. We have to do our own integration. We have to do our own release of our shadow, being aware that we've played many roles ourselves in this lifetime and other lifetimes in multidimensionality. And as one with these brothers and sisters that we may call the black hats, because we're connected to them, we can't not be connected to them. We always have to look back at this. It's not just woo woo, it's a quantum model. We are one collective. Corey says we look to some of those higher, more evolved beings that are maybe fifth dimensional and north of that as a schizophrenic mind of all of these fractalized human personalities that are playing all these roles. But it still happens to be true, whether you're looking at it from one perspective or another. We're going to have to be developmentally compassionate, forgiving, so that we can all move into a wholeness principle moving forward. So share some of your thoughts and maybe give a little bit of the props and data drops for the video that you put out today and some of the writing that you've done that hits the nail on the head of exactly that idea, Simon.
Yes. Okay. So the way that I look at it is this: that this human collective um, is something that the black hats were aware of very, very early on. That the power of the collective was something to be tapped and wielded. So, one of the things that they became aware of was that if they attack innocence in a sufficient number of individuals on the planet, then the collective innocence becomes suppressed, becomes um,
Traumatized.
inactive. Yeah, it,
Mhm.
it it really is about traumatizing the collective innocence, and that's important to understand because this point within us that is our innocence, this inner child that we each carry as individuals, that is our connection to source, right? It's a very close connection to source, and that there is something tactical at play with creating systems of child abuse around the planet, it makes sure that accessing the power of innocence is much more difficult in the conditions of this planet. And that's
Mhm.
why this video that I put out today, I think, is very important, because we want to start to heal that wounded child. And that even if you're not a direct victim of these kinds of abuses, you are still part of a collective that has this wounded innocence, this wounded inner child. So
Mhm.
that's why it's so powerful right now to begin doing that work, because it will ripple through the planet and it will help heal the actual victims coming out of these programs. That if we
Mhm.
create a planet that honors and respects and cares for innocence, then the healing that is necessary can follow from those conditions.
Yummy, yummy. I love this. This is very powerful work. In a course that I teach on energy medical intuition, we follow Carolyn Mace's expansive work on the archetypes. And that's what I'm really hearing you talk about right now, Simon. And one of the main archetypes that it's one of the main ones showing up for us now is this wounded child. We have wounded healers. We have the archetypes of the victim and the saboteur and some of the real mainstream ones. But where there has been the wounded healer, where there has been wounded innocence, the wounded child, it may not be your direct experience, as you've said, but it may be coming up in your field. It may be resonating in your field. You're attracting others around you because you have the bandwidth to hold space for their healing. You have the resonance to be able to not shy away and not be intimidated or threatened or lose a part of yourself while those that are around you are processing this kind of restoration of wholeness. So many of us are going to be called to action to do big archetypal work on a societal level, don't you feel?
Yes, yes, it's so, so important that we hear that call right now. That being as close as we are to, public releases of information, there is so much that we can be doing on that individual and on that archetypal level. And,
Mm-hmm.
for me, discovering that my innocence was my true connection to the collective consciousness, that my
Mm-hmm.
innocence was my access to the oneness of the human mind, the shared
Mm-hmm.
human mind, that it made sense to me tactically why the darkness decided to do this, right? Connect, they connected the dots to understand that if they did this enough, that the human collective would not become coherent. But now we have this knowledge and we can flip it around the other way and develop this coherence. So not only will we be helping to heal trauma and move people past the trauma, but we will actually be increasing the actual consciousness of the human collective. By healing innocence, unity becomes more accessible.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so clean to be able to say that as we are returning to this wholeness, as those that may have been traumatized or witnessed the trauma and the segregation and being unhinged, this is really the path to the ultimate state of evolution that we all want. Knowledge is knowledge, experience is experience, but knowledge and experience beautifully woven together is the platform for developing wisdom. And only with wisdom can we become these evolutionary beings that we all came here to be. That means it got rocky. It means life did not just flow along in a nice, peaceful, and always sustainable rhythm and beat. It means that we learned how to integrate from a much larger purview. And I think that you just keep touching on that again and again is we're developing wisdom, and with wisdom comes compassion and a bigger view of why the world has worked this way and what we can do to take that applied wisdom and just lovingly navigate it back into some greater harmony, greater wholeness for ourselves first, and then for these communities, these families going outward. Let's get some people back to where they can find your work, Simon. I know we're wrapping up on the hour, and you and I could probably take a long weekend and just go into this in soundbite after soundbite, and maybe we still will. But for the sake of our audience that wants to know where they can hear more from you, both your videos, some of the places you're going to be speaking, and maybe some of your blog work, tell them where they can go.
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube. It's YouTube facebook.com/Simon Esler. And then you can also find me on Facebook. You can search Simon Esler 1111, and that'll bring you to my Facebook page where you can explore some of my work. And then I'm also doing some work for the Sphere Being Alliance media. So I'm helping to develop some secret space program material that I'm really excited about. So you can expect some of that to come out in the near future. And in general, I'm looking to connect more with the community on offering guided meditations and one-on-one work, so people can reach out to me for that as well.
Yay, good. I'm excited about that, and I'm excited to put an invitation out to you. Stephen Cephalo, who I've had featured on Waking Up Solutionary TV for his contributions to the artwork submissions for Sphere Being Alliance and the Guardian artwork, and some upcoming projects that I'll leave for him to dispel. He's here in North Carolina, and we've realized that a lot of these conferences and these major gatherings have a tendency to be west of the Mississippi. In fact, mostly, right there in the Front Range in Colorado and all the way out to the coast. So California, Colorado, some of these areas have been able to see a lot more of these community leaders and these way showers that our audience is really hungry to get in touch with. Well, I spoke to Corey, I spoke to Rob and Ben, and also to Adam Riva and a handful of other really great people, and said, how would you feel about an invitation to bring some of these New Yorkers and these, Midwestern folks that are doing the kind of work that you're doing, and have them come out here as soon as next spring. So that's in the works, Simon. I think your voice, I think that the gentleness with which you are able to get really in resonance with people would be a huge contribution. So I'd like to invite you to come out and consider joining us. We're looking at somewhere between April and May. Would you consider that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to.
Good. We've got a big community, and we need to cater to where they are. Having the mountain always go to Muhammad, or Muhammad to the mountain, we need to kind of create some segue points. So I want to thank you, Simon. Let's consider continuing the conversation in a future show. The wisdom that you bring and the youth that you have, so much wisdom, is astonishing. It's very inspiring. And I think that we have a lot of young people that are really, really going to get you. They're going to resonate with where you're coming from, and you're going to bring a lot of hope. So I thank you personally. I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us tonight. And I want to go back to our community. If you can be served with more of Simon's content and these voices that have come onto Waking Up Solutionary TV, talking about intentional community, talking about new systems of governance, new systems of basically your hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our food, our air, our water, our clothing, our community, our homes. There are resources. We don't have to wait for full disclosure. None of us are pinned down to the next data drop from a prophet, a seer, a revelator, or QAnon. We can be instrumental right now. That's the hopefulness of this message. And I want to shout out to all of you that are considering, what can I do? If you don't feel like you can dive in right away, listen, Simon has a Patreon. Edge of Wonder, those guys have a Patreon. Jordan Sather has one. We have sponsorships. We have ways of doing it. We would love to have you be a sponsor here at Solutionary TV, or a Patreon here, so that we can continue to show you we're a much bigger community than many of us have given us credit for. And we're about to make some really powerful changes that you don't want to miss out on. So join us, be a part of it. Know that we love you. We are so grateful for you. You make all of this worth it. And together with you, with us, together, we are the solution.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and deltaforce.net.